Hello and welcome to the Rhodes Centre podcast. We have a rather unusual guest today because this person is neither an economist nor a political economist, nor anyone who pretends to know anything about economics in general. But he did write a fascinating book. The book in question is The Idealist, Wendell Willkie's Wartime Quest to Build One World. The author is Samuel Zipp. He's up brown. He goes by Sandy, so I'll be calling him Sandy. And it's a great book, and I wanted to bring him in because I think that the issues that he raises in the book are really germane to questions of globalization, global governance, and other things which really broadly fall under the remit of the Rhodes Centre. So welcome, Sandy. Congratulations on the book. When I start big book projects, you know, I have ideas and I think to myself, oh, that's a good one, that's a bad one, whatever. And, you know, most of them never see the light of day. This one clearly has. Why did you choose Wendell Willkie, of all people?
Well, I think Willkie's an interesting character in a way that we haven't fully anticipated or appreciated anymore. He's sort of lens onto a whole bunch of other questions, bigger questions in American politics and culture that I think have gone sort of slipped under the radar. And he's a fascinating way to get at a whole host of stories about internationalism and about globalization at large. And I came to him largely through thinking about transformations in internationalism during World War II, thinking about trying to find stories of popular internationalists, people who spoke to a large audience, a sort of middle-class, middle-brow audience with challenging ideas about the way the United States confronted the world at mid-century and particularly during World War II. And I think gives us ways to think about our own dilemmas today.
Let's get into those issues, but most people will not know who Willkie is. So let's start basically with a little biography of the man in that sense. And the fact that he was not just a liberal Republican, very rare these days, he was an internationalist Republican. And he was in many ways an internationalist before he did this trip and before he writes this book that makes him ultra famous in that moment. So let's run through that a little bit. Give us some background on this.
Sure. I mean, the thing to understand about Willkie is that in many ways he's a Republican sort of convenience, by convenience. He's begins his life as a sort of a Wilsonian Democrat, a Woodrow Wilson Democrat. Wilson was one of his heroes early in his life. He grew up as an internationalist. He was part of a family that valued civic interaction and inspired his interest in civic issues, particularly around the questions of American empire at the turn of the century when he was a boy. And he got into democratic politics on the one hand to support the League of Nations, and on the other hand to contest the Ku Klux Klan in the Midwest where he was from. He was from Indiana. But what happens is that he ends up as a critic of the New Deal because he's also someone who favors free enterprise and free trade, and is a lawyer and a energy industry lawyer. He's a lawyer for essentially the Power Trust in the 1930s. And so he becomes a critic of the New Deal, although he is a mild critic of the New Deal compared to many on the right. And so there's this group of liberal Republican internationalists, mostly New York City folks and others who are wanting to contest within the Republican Party the dominance of the old guard, who are, what we think of as isolationists, essentially nationalist Republicans, who recruit him to come over to the Republican Party and run against Roosevelt in 1940. So he is the hand-picked candidate of a group of mostly well-to-do East Coast liberal Republicans who we might think of today as in the tradition of the Rockefeller Republican or the Northeast liberal Republicans, people around Time Life magazine, like Henry Luce, although he separates himself from Luce quite quickly. But there's this whole tradition that Willkie represents of someone who is a liberal in his social politics, what would have been a kind of classical liberal in economics, and who very quickly begins to move to the left during the war.
He also had a very interesting stance on racial politics in the United States, right?
Yeah, he's from very early on, he is an advocate of civil rights, right? As I said, his early experience with the Ku Klux Klan during its revival in the 1920s in the Midwest, in his home state of Indiana, inspired him against to favor civil rights. And he becomes, in the 1930s and 40s, a very active campaigner for civil rights. And in fact, his position in the Republican Party, ironically, allows him to stake out positions to the left of Franklin Roosevelt on race, right? He's for an anti-lynching bill. He's against the poll tax. He makes a quite profound friendship with Walter White, the head of the NAACP in these years. And so he becomes someone who can stake out a position to the left of Roosevelt on race, because Roosevelt is, of course, constrained by the Southern Democrats, the white supremacist Democrats in his party. And so he gains a lot of support. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and other major African-American newspapers endorse him. So this is part of what he takes on too. And in keeping with that and in concert with that, he learns quite well from his African-American allies about the way that African-American political campaigners in these years were linking national and international issues and looking at civil rights as akin to the struggle for freedom from colonialism and empire abroad.
Usually when you lose a presidential contest, particularly when you really lose, as he did in 1940, that's it. It's game over, right? You go back to the farm, nobody ever hears from you again. But he maintains a friendship with Roosevelt, which then blossoms into this trip, which is the prelude, if you will, to the book and the main item that you write about in the book. How did that come about? How did he survive? How was he friends with the guy that whipped him?
Well, I think that because Willkie is such a wild card in American politics, right? He's not somebody who was a politician before he was drafted to run. He sort of emerges into the stream of regular American political life from an angle and sort of askew to that, and so he continues to cultivate his persona as a kind of genial outsider, someone who's willing to critique people like Roosevelt and also people within the Republican Party, but who's a sort of a loyalist as well. And since he was during these years had sort of safely put the question of interventionism in World War II off the kind of political, out of the political debate in the lead up to World War II, Roosevelt trusts him. And so Roosevelt has some sense that he is an ally on certain issues, although they disagree on some others. And so what happens is that Roosevelt feels that Willkie is a useful spokesperson for American internationalist positions as the United States is heading into World War II, right? So Willkie speaks up for Lend-Lease, quite crucially on the floor of Congress as it's being debated. And then basically Willkie is looking for a way to keep his name in the press, and he goes to Roosevelt with the idea of this trip. The trip is actually floated by some journalists in Moscow who want to see Willkie's sort of charismatic political figure to do more sort of public relations work for the American war effort. And so the idea of the trip at first in Roosevelt's eyes is as a sort of PR for the war effort, but Willkie makes it much more than that.
So let's get into the trip, but before that I want to sort of flag what I found deeply impressive about the book is in each of the chapters where you talk about where he lands. You start with this is Willkie and this is what he does, but then you give us a very concise history of the very fraught politics of each of these places that he visits, and then you move back to Willkie and how he negotiates and navigates that and what he does with that in a sense, and that's the flow that goes through. That's why I really recommend people engage with it. It's wonderfully done. Let's cherry pick a few of those trips and talk a little bit about the politics that he's walking into and then how this affects Willkie. So he's going in a sense, as an unusual, charismatic, all-American Hoosier, honest broker. We're the Yanks. We're not the colonial bastards that you're used to, etc., etc.
Right.
We're great. And then he goes to these places where he's never set foot before and tries very hard to get local on the politics there and talk to as many ordinary people as he possibly can, even under trying circumstances. And then it kind of shapes what he takes to the next destination. So let's begin. He begins in Egypt and then flies on to Turkey. What is it that he sees there and what is it that he gets out of that part of the trip?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, let me say thanks for noticing and appreciating this part of the book, which I think was the hardest part of the book to write, which is to really try to understand what it is that someone like Willkie, with his antenna all aflutter for all kinds of sort of to the ground wisdom, you might say, in these places, what it is how this shaped him in these 13 countries that he went to on 5 continents. Right. So in Egypt and Turkey, right, this is where he's awakening to the fact that the war is not as simple as he had imagined it to be. And that conventional wisdom imagines it to be. Now, he's had an inkling of this before, like I said, through his African American allies and through his through his general internationalism. But it's in Egypt where he really confronts the fact that the British, who are at that moment, he arrives just at the turning point of the conflict there. He arrives just during the Battle of El Alamein, and he meets General Bernard Montgomery just as he's turning the Nazis back, turning Rommel back there, and he has a conference with him. But he begins to realize that the British, while quite dedicated, obviously, to winning the war, and he admires them for their grit and their steel in the face of this overwhelming Nazi attack, that they haven't begun to yet think about the war in any broader terms, and that they're quite committed to a war that will preserve empire, and preserve their empire and the vestiges of their sort of semi-colonial rule, particularly in Egypt. And so I tell the whole history of that rule and the way Egyptians see it, and the way Willkie tries to understand what they feel about the British presence there in the wake of the Ottoman Empire, and how many Egyptians see the British as in some ways no different than the Nazis. We can safely from our distance say that they were mistaken about that. But I think to Willkie, that's an important moment to see that he needs to imagine himself not just as an American who is not quite a stuffy Britishman, but somebody who aligns himself with the positions that he sees people taking around the world, and to see the war as a different place, a different kind of shaping of the world, so to speak. He flies on to Turkey, and that's where he starts to see an alternative possibility, right? A new nationalism that, for all its warts, and he kind of doesn't always see the warts, is a vision for a new kind of what we might call a sort of global South vision in our own language of a new polity that balances nationalism and internationalism out of the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, and tries to forge a balance outside of the sort of great power politics that have structured the world of empires before. So he's hopeful that that's a model that he can find in other places around the globe.
So the first visit is essentially, whoa, this imperialism stuff is actually serious, and we're allying with the Brits, and they really are just totally just want to keep things as they are. Then he begins
to feel that.
Yeah, Then he goes to Ataturk's Turkey and finds kind of, if you will, forced modernity with the human face. Right.
Yeah. What seems like a human face. Behind the scenes, I think it's a little less
then he kind of goes back a little bit and then goes to Beirut and Jerusalem. What is it he takes out of these places?
Well, these places are both in the sort of affected by mandate politics, right? By the mandates that have been erected after World War I by the French and the British. And it's here that he really begins to feel how powerfully the politics of these places are geared towards preserving at whatever cost British and French influence over the region in the face of this great upheaval. And I think this is really in some ways this and his trips to Iraq and Iran, which I won't tarry on too much, but which are the places where he sees that this is really the hinge of the world, right? The Middle East as we come to know it later, and the place where so many sort of imperial dreams go to die, right? He starts to see that this is the place where new kinds of ideas about the world are being shaped, fraught ones, but ones that need to be heard and are being really suppressed and pressed down by both the British. I mean, his interview with de Gaulle in Beirut is quite telling, where de Gaulle is just completely dismissive of the idea that the French will need to change their policies towards Syria and Lebanon in any way after the war, and they will resist the British trying to make them do so in a self-interested way, or the Americans in also a self-interested way, which pretends to be non-self-interested. So it's here that he sees all the fraught tangents of the war, the kind of vectors of things that are bearing down on this imperial world and threatening to blast it apart. And Willkie wants the United States to take a progressive role out of that and to help those folks to guarantee and find their freedom.
So he's not officially an anti-imperialist at this point, but he's definitely moving in that direction.
I mean, he is on paper, I think, but I think he's beginning to realize what it will really take to be an anti-imperialist. Right. And he's beginning to have to confront that the United States is itself transitioning into a greater imperial role, moving from a kind of hemispheric and Pacific imperial power to a global imperial power. And it's been underway for some time at this point, but will, of course, really be solidified by the war. And he's starting to see that there are Americans who want to essentially succeed the British as the global hegemon, and that he needs to find ways to open up the possibility that more Americans will question that role, while at the same time he thinks of himself as a great and patriotic American, right, and someone who believes in Americanism. And so that sort of American exceptionalism creeps into a lot of what he does, and will continue that thread of ambivalence that works through Willkie throughout this period.
So there's just two voices in a sense then. There's the kind of Teddy Roosevelt, manifest destiny leading through the loose people towards America's century. And then there's this liberal internationalist Republican, and then people who are more on the left, who are essentially saying, no, there's an entirely different thing that is America. And that's what we need to basically find, and that's what we need to bring out. Now right, he brings that view very much, I think, in the book. That's what he brings to Russia. Right? He's, in a sense, I read him as being at his most American in that sense, in that moment. He was really representing, if you will, I am a stereotype of American culture, and this is what it is, and it's kind of good, and we're actually really just like you guys, even though you're communists under Stalin. Is that a fair way of reading his interaction and when he gets to Russia?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is that Willkie is part of a tradition and a tendency in American politics and culture that made itself most felt during the war years, and we have sort of, unless you're a professional historian of these years, have sort of lost track of. And that was this idea that the United States and the Soviet Union could work together, and could work together to shape a more beneficent world. This was a significant political tendency on the sort of center left in these years. It was cautious about communism, and so not a sort of fellow traveling that you saw on the further left around say Henry Wallace, whose challenges to the American century are ones that we more often remember than Willkie's one world idea. But Willkie was trying to sort of forge a path between these that would show that there was a way to sort of bring the Soviets on board into a shared project of modernization for the world at large, and for a kind of enlightened leadership towards the world. Right? There was obviously a number of illusions shaping this vision, but it was more possible at this moment in 1942 and 43 than at any time before, as Stalin had been forced to open up in some ways vis-a-vis religion, vis-a-vis his critics, vis-a-vis other parts of the of his communist dictatorship. And so there was some sense, even amongst folks like Roosevelt, that they could perhaps pry the Soviet Union away from its developing authoritarianism, what was in these years coming to be called totalitarianism, of course, and make for a kind of a world-shaping partnership between these two great powers that would allow, in Willkie's eyes, this was really what was most important to Willkie and distinguishes him from Roosevelt, would really allow for the United States to take a forthright and immediate role in decolonization along with the Soviet Union, and not to try to head off what would become the Cold War. They didn't have those words yet, of course, but they had a sense of an approaching standoff between the two, really freezing in place the imperial world from before in a new shape. And Willkie was trying to put a wedge into that, open it up by bringing the two great powers, incipient great powers, together. A fruitless task, as we know from our history, but also one that deserves, I think, to be reseen in the context in which it happened.
Well, I wonder how fruitless it was in the following sense. So, I mean, I'm working on a book just now called The New Politics of Growth and Stagnation with a couple of other scholars, with many other scholars, in fact. And the lodestone for all of this literature was a book that was done in 1965 by a guy called Andrew Schoenfeld called Modern Capitalism. And this was the high point of something you referenced briefly in the book, the convergence literature, which basically says there are these modernization processes, and they affect everyone. They may be refracted through local institutions and different political systems, but we're kind of all heading in the same way. And the answer is some kind of mixed economy, welfare state, and it'll be weighted in different ways and all that sort of stuff. And for a while, even if the internationalist governance dream faded and fizzled and crackled on what the UN became. That was a very powerful idea that went on for a long time. And there's a bit of the book which really reminded me of this when he was in Russia and he was out in the Far East and he was looking at some town or Tust or one of these places where he was saying the boardwalks that they had were just like Indiana had back in the day when his dad was first getting there. And there's very much this, if you will, enlightened stage theory of history, which isn't one of racial hierarchies and these people will never get there and these people will get there. It's simply there are these underlying processes. We all go through them. I'm standing here in the furthest part of the Soviet Union and I can see Indiana 50 years ago. And it's just a question of everybody getting there. Is that really where he was? Is that what was going on with him by the time that he gets on that plane to go to China?
I think that was sort of the assumption he had. I don't think he had worked it out in those terms, but as somebody who had worked for the power industry, who knew his way around a dam, knew his way, he had been involved in harnessing electricity from what would become the grounds where the Tennessee Valley Authority was created by Roosevelt. It's what he contested, right? He knew this world, and it was sort of his lingua franca, his way of seeing the world was through projects of great modernization, even though those ended up being more state-run than he would have liked them to be, particularly in his 1930s iteration. But that's kind of where he was. I mean, I have a sense that this is part of that sort of history of modernization and convergence, which takes us up into the post-war era. What I wanted to do was give us a sense of the way that it worked just before that high modernist era, right? And also at a moment where before the ideological divides between first and second world had been drawn so powerfully, right? And so what I don't have a good sense for, and you would know better than I would, is the way that those convergence theory ideas really imagined a way out of the Cold War. I mean, because at the same time, right, there's a wing of them that is promoting the proxy wars of the Cold War, right? I mean, in a sense, stage theory and modernization are one of the motivations for the war in Vietnam in some sense, right? So it seems like it becomes that idea becomes later on a much more, quite fractured idea, as everything does in that period. But back in the 40s, you have this moment where you could imagine it not as a mode of competition between first and second worlds and something to be kind of imposed on the third world, but as a unifying factor that could continue that upward sway that would put the world of empire behind it and issue everyone into this one world.
So the next stop on his trip is China, and so far in the book, what I'm seeing is he confronts the reality of British and French imperialism, and he's kind of repelled by it. He then sees moments of possibility in Turkey and Iran. He goes to Russia as the Hoosier who basically wants to convince the communists we're all on the same track. And then when he gets to China, it kind of goes off track a little bit. I wasn't quite sure how he processed China. What did he get out of that?
Well, so China's interesting for him because he's predisposed to essentially fall in love with China. Like so many Americans, he has a series of romantic, essentially Orientalist ideas about China as a sort of land of destiny, the sort of the place that the explorers were going when they found America, right? As part of America's destiny. So really this idea about China as America's, little brother that is being brought up through the ranks for all these years under the auspices of the nationalists, which flows very powerfully through many Americans' ideas about China these years. And Willkie is no different from that. So he has very romanticized ideas about the nationalist government, about Chiang Kai-shek. He has a somewhat gossipy and not entirely able to be, we can't exactly confirm it, that he has supposedly an affair with Madame Chang during his time there. But he's really under the sway of Chinese nationalists. So this is where he loses much of his critical ideas about the world and sort of some of that, some of the way that he remains independent drops away during the China visit. But I think at the same time, what he's seeing in China is the full fulfillment, he hopes, of what he saw in Turkey, right? This sort of nationalist enterprise that is also internationalist and also anti-imperial, right? And so, the Chiang Kai-shek regime is in close contact with Gandhi and Nehru in India. They are seeing themselves as aligned with that kind, what will become the non-aligned movement later, despite the fact that they are trying to crush its left wing in the shape of Mao at the same time, right? Or waiting to crush it on the other side of the war. So Willkie goes there. He sympathized with both the communists and the nationalists, hopes that their differences, wishful thinking, hopes that their differences are just skin deep, and kind of swallows whole a lot of nationalist propaganda, while at the same time being able to bring home to Americans a vision of a kind of anti-imperialist nationalism, right? A sort of a very uneasy balance between internationalism and nationalism that's being forged by so many of these actors in what would become the quote unquote third world in those years. And he's quite taken with this idea and wants this to be the thing that Americans see, right? He says, I'm bringing home an invitation from the people of the East to see that this is the war that we need to see. This is the world war that we need to understand, not just a contest between freedom and fascism, but that the freedom is being fought for all over the world by people who are trying to emerge from the world of European empire. And that is the message that he thinks China really tells.
So eventually he flies out of China and he gets back home, and then he writes a book about this trip, and it flies off the shelves. It's an incredible bestseller, way beyond anyone's expectations. What has he tapped into, and what is he, in a sense, accelerating at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, maybe one of the more surprising things about this story is how powerfully popular One World was as a book, right? I mean, it sells many millions of copies. I think we're not really even sure how many millions of copies it sold. The estimates at the time were 4 million. It was in all kinds of, editions. It was in a news print edition, a hardcover edition. It went, Book of the Month Club. It was serialized. There was a comic book version of it, right? Really kind of one of these, sort of shaping documents of wartime, right? One of the things that really conditioned Americans' lives, like the musical Oklahoma. People compared it to Uncle Tom's Cabin. People said it was the fastest selling book in American history. I think what he's tapping into was this sense that anything was possible during the war, that all bets were off in some sense for how the United States might proceed, going forward. And I also think he was tapping into a bit of confusion going on during this period, right? A sort of sense that many different paths were available, and a sort of a sense in that moment that that people didn't have a major sense of distinction between all these different paths, right? That they hadn't yet sorted out one path as to the right or to the left, one path as one that took us into more of a confrontation with the Soviet Union, one that took us more into a partnership with our former allies, right? It was just, there was a lot of amorphous discussion then about making our way back into the world, away from that, the world of so-called isolationism, which is a sort of misleading term, but reactivating the United States' interest in the world, which had never really died, but which had kind of faded from American political life during the Great Depression. And so One World becomes a sort of talisman of this sense on the part of the American public that they are going to re-enter the world in a powerfully important way, and that it's due to the war and due to the conditions of flight and communications that are starting to seem so powerful in people's lives. People are spending so much time in these years thinking about places around the world they've never thought about before, looking at new kinds of maps that shape the world in different sort of ways, thinking about global flight in a way that is all new to them, of course. And so Willkie becomes a talisman of this, and the book really flies off the shelves. And his speeches in these months, 36 million people are listening to them, and they're really open at this moment to a kind of progressive vision of anti-imperial global responsibility for the United States in a way that they may have not been before, and which they wouldn't afterwards.
But much of what he's saying, in a sense, is going beyond where Roosevelt and the government is confident.
That's right.
So another example, there's another book I was rereading recently, which is Eric Halliner's book, The Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods. And what he points out there is that many of the ideas that we come to think of as the Bretton Woods settlement, the idea of a World Bank for Reconstruction and Development that would basically displace commercial lending, the IMF in a very different role, etc., etc., all came from like theorists in Latin America. Right, there was like this southern ideas coming into the core, and in a sense, I had this feeling that what Willkie was doing was like flying around the world, grabbing these ideas, and coming home and dumping them in Roosevelt's lap, and saying, "All right, then deal with it." Was there conflict between the two of them when he got back? Because there's also that massively intriguing bit where you talk about Roosevelt toyed with the idea of essentially abandoning the Democrats and joining with Willkie in a new political party. I'd never heard of that. Can you just unpack some of that stuff?
Yeah, sure. Let's start a little bit before that, right? That happens in late 1944, just before Willkie dies. But what happens in the period between Willkie's trip in the fall of 1942, the release of One World in the spring of 1943, and Willkie's death in October of 1944 is a host of complicated things. One of which is that Willkie becomes a kind of gadfly to Roosevelt, and this is sort of at a distance, not always face to face, although they do meet several times face to face during this period. And Willkie is essentially trying to push Roosevelt to the left on questions of world cooperation, the shape of a future world body that will end up being the UN, and the role of smaller countries and colonized countries in this moment. And so what Willkie does is he pushes towards the idea of a United Nations that will not be structured around a Security Council, that will not preserve as much national sovereignty as it ends up doing so. And he wants to convene during the war a council of all the allies and give them all an equal role in shaping this organization against the kinds of, at that point, still behind the scenes negotiations that are going on around the shaping of the UN, or with folks like Cordell Hull and with Roosevelt, who want to, of course, create what comes to become the Security Council. So Willkie's out there campaigning for this, amongst a number of other things, civil rights, and becoming a sort of left wing of the center gadfly against Roosevelt, who is really looking for a more workable and safe kind of compromise to shepherd American interests into the post-war era. And so this is kind of the fascinating moment that he has, right? The other thing that happens during this period is that he tries to run again for president, and he fails rather more dramatically than he did in 1940, where he doesn't make it to the Republican nomination. The right wing, or the sort of even the center of the Republican Party at this point, has sort of had it with him. And so at this point, what happens is that in the late fall of, or sort of the late summer and early fall of 1944, I guess it is, Roosevelt is looking around and not liking what he sees for his political prospects, and Willkie is too. Then both of them are looking for different options. Willkie sees that his time is done in the Republican Party, that he has little hope of succeeding there going forward. Roosevelt is starting to feel the sort of conservative counterwave within the Democratic Party that's chipping away at the New Deal, particularly in the South and Midwest. And he floats the idea. First, he actually floats the idea of Willkie becoming his running mate in 44. That kind of quickly dies. But then he floats the idea that each of them might leave their parties and form a third party, right? A liberal third party that would take the right wing, sometimes, of the Democratic Party, and the left wing of the Republican Party, and kind of find this new political center. It kind of founders in the end on personal distrust between them, because the idea, the sort of back channel negotiations they're doing keep getting leaked, and Willkie becomes suspicious that Roosevelt is, for some reason he can't understand, leaking them. The canny and ever sort of savvy Roosevelt, thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead, and Willkie's sort of like, I don't know what this guy's up to. Right. So he backs off of it in the end. But it's a fascinating moment where you see the possibility of another kind of political confirmation for the post-war era, where had both of them lived, you might have seen a different kind of approach to the dawning Cold War from a kind of from the political center, rather than the sort of Cold War nationalism and the sort of left wing solidifying around Wallace, which is very defeating for the left wing because of his sort of unwillingness to step away from communism. If you had a center which had a more complicated, let's say, more nuanced relation to communism, it may not have forestalled the Cold War. Of course, it seems hard to have done, and it's all armchair thinking at this point. But it's a fascinating moment. Yeah,
the counterfactual I was interested in. I mean, spoiler alert! You already mentioned that he dies. This is the story ends quickly. But had he not had, I think it was 14 heart attacks in a very short period of time, he might have been Truman.
Yeah, in some ways, he might have been a Truman figure who was more willing to work for a more internationalist vision of the kind of liberal position leading into the Cold War, maybe potentially offsetting some of the nationalist energies that were drawing together around the liberal internationalism that shapes the Cold War. I think that's hard to predict. I mean, I think it's possible that Willkie would have just fallen in line with that kind of liberal internationalist. Liberal internationalist nationalism, which is what the sort of Cold War nationalism.
One other wrinkle that stood out in the end of the book, I think that Willkie was surprised by how quickly his ideas and how popular they were, how quickly they were accepted, how popular they were when the book came out. But then amongst the people that he counted on the most, how quickly they died. So long before the Berlin blockade, long before the Iron Curtain speech, essentially, not just the Luces, lots of other people who were to the left of them had essentially said, no, we're not doing this. We used to be internationalists, but we're not anymore. We're now basically neo-nationalists. What happened in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, it sort of depends on how you tell this story. There is one way to tell this story where the Cold War doesn't really begin till 1948. Right. There's another way to tell the story, and I think Willkie's story is the version of it that shows this, is that the Cold War is already beginning in 1944. And I call the chapter about this in my book, The Narrows of 1944, where the political space for Willkie's sort of center-left internationalism narrows dramatically in these periods. And this is largely because his centrist allies start to move to the right with a series of things that happen vis-a-vis Stalin, essentially. And they begin to construct the idea of Stalin as the authoritarian boogeyman that fuels the Cold War, in which there's plenty, of course, evidence for. In some sense, of course, Stalin was still a figure who was open to some flexibility, although he was moving more and more towards the role that he took in the early Cold War, as he began to feel that the United States and England were not going to allow him to safeguard his western borders, which was the most important thing for him in many ways. So anyway, there's the whole Katyn Forest controversy, where the Germans announced that the Soviets have killed 22,000 Polish officers, which is not proven, but which is later was proven, of course. And so these sort of things begin to carve off a whole host of sort of centrist liberals who start to see that, who really influenced by the kind of Manichaean thinking of World War II, right? Freedom versus fascism, begin to associate the Soviet Union with the new force of fascism that they'll call totalitarianism. And there are many figures who embrace that and move towards that vision of the world.
So when we started talking, you mentioned the current moment, the sort of the globalization moment, possibly now post-COVID, post-global Trumpism, we're now in a kind of different space again. So let's close it out with this. You in the book, you mentioned Willkie's foreign affairs piece just before he died, which you say is his most sophisticated self-understanding of what he was doing. And the claim that he makes is, as far as I can understand it, is a kind of technocratic centrism plus globalism. Right? Mm-hmm. In a sense, it's very much, he would never put it this way because I think he's to the left of this, but it's kind of a proto-Davos man version of liberalism, right? And the claim that he makes in that piece, which you highlight, is that freedom in a complex and interdependent world is maximized to the degree to which you accept that as fact. And therefore, when you accept that as fact, you work within it. And this is very much a rules-based globalization, quasi-Davos understanding of things. And of course, what that risked, and I think in my world, in my understanding of this, what that exposed was democracy in the nation state becomes somewhat redundant. And that invites that kind of nationalist, kickback. So could we take today's frame of the breakdown of our globalism and put that on Willkie's world and say, yeah, that's kind of what undermined it as well in that period, was this disjuncture between democracy, the nation state, and where this global thing could go. And many of the elites just got very uncomfortable with that, as they seem to have done now.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I mean, I think Willkie would have thought of what he was saying in that foreign affairs piece as a way to advance a more progressive and more democratic version of a global rules-based order that was underway and in shape in those years in the discussions leading up to the formation of the UN. I think it was hard for him to see how much of this would be undermined by the ways that this has by the sort of political economic history here, right? Because he was, in some sense, a conventional free trader, a conventional middle of the road, classical liberal, right? He would have been, in our eyes today, he would be seen as a kind of neoliberal. But he was, on the other hand, he imagined this as a kind of democratic opportunity for all parts of the world to participate equally in his ideal of free trade, right? So it was hard for him to see the way that the sort of advantage accrued to the big players in the market in that period. And that was hard for him to see. And I think it was hard for him to see how that would lead to a kind of undermining of his idea. So while I'm not sure, I think he may have been the kind of person who would have enjoyed hobnobbing at a place like Davos. I think he imagined himself as perhaps not somebody who would have been instead at the World Social Forum, but somebody who embodied some sort of relation between these two worlds and hoped to find a middle ground between them. And, I think coming to our own time, to me, Willkie remains important because he asks us to think about a sort of another time of global crisis in which, this whole fraught world that we're now living in today, all these things are up for grabs again, right? We've seen the establishment again of an America First ideal, right? This America First ideal was the first America First was one of Willkie's greatest opponents, right? Lindbergh, jousted with Willkie many times. Charles Lindbergh, one of the great spokespeople for America First. I think Willkie now today is important for us because he asks us to sort of go back to this period and see what resources it might have for us today, right? That was one hinge moment, right? A moment between the world shaped by European empire and the world shaped by American capitalism. And now we're in this new hinge moment, I think. We've seen a few of them over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, and I think this is a big one, right? American power is on the wane. We're living through another hinge moment. 21st century is going to be shaped by a host of new factors, right? Chinese state capitalism, Russian authoritarianism, right? Simultaneously rising prosperity and
viral
equality.
pandemics.
Yes, right.
Climate
pandemics
change.
and global warming, right? These things are things we now have to confront. And the global upsurge of nationalism that has kind of unseated, or at least tried to unseat Davos man, I like that, as the kind of conventional wisdom about globalization, is it's in need of a challenge from the left that can imagine a kind of more democratic globalization, right? There is one from the left, that is an anti-imperial, that collects around all the social movements since the 1960s. And that's an important one to see. But I think this is also another one because it has the chance of winning more people in the center to it and creating a kind of center-left bridge there. So in many ways, we're at a point, right, where the United States can no longer really pretend to lead the rest of the world. And Willkie's journey asks us to think about how we're going to live in that world rather than try to dominate it. And that's why I wrote the book, is to try to get us to think about that problem and that dilemma again today.
That's a great place to end it. Well, Sandy, thanks for coming on and talking the book. Just in case we do get this on video, this is it. It's a big one, but it's beautifully written and it's a great read, and I got tons out of it. So thank you very much, Sandy, and I'll see you around the block, I guess.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate it.
This episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast was produced by Dan Richards. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. If you like us, rate us on iTunes and help others find the podcast as well. For more information, go to watson.brown.edu/Rhodes. Thanks for listening.